Okay, so continuing on with rearranging formulas, we want to look at formulas that perhaps have some powers in them. So keep in mind that powers and roots are inverse operations. They undo each other. So for example, if I had a square, then a square root would undo that operation. If I had a cube, then a cube root would undo that operation, and so on. If I had power 4, then I could do the fourth root. Okay, so on your calculator, you're probably going to have a power button that probably looks like this, and then close by you might have a root button. And most calculators, if you have a fairly new one, when you're doing a root, you put the type of root in first, and then the button, and then the value inside the root. Okay, but we'll look at that in a second. Okay, so for example, we have a formula here for area of a circle, which is pi r squared, and we want to isolate for the letter or the variable r. So if you were doing, so remember we did two methods. We did sort of a flow chart, or we did it algebraically. So if I wanted to solve by a flow chart, I'm going to start with the letter I want to isolate for, so R, and I'm going to look at the first thing that happened to the R, that was applied to the R, which operation went first. So the first thing that was applied to the R is that it was squared. Okay, so we'll just put square. So R is squared, and we come up with R squared. And then after that, we multiplied by pi. So you have to remember that order matters. You have to ask yourself, did I multiply by pi first, or did I square first? I know I squared first because the pi is not squared and there's no brackets around it. So the pi was done last. And then that equals A, right? That equals A. So we're going to undo the operation. So if we multiply by pi, we're going to divide by pi. And that will give me A divided by pi. And then we squared, so then we're going to square root. So it will be all inside the square root, A divided by pi, and that will equal R. Okay, so that's how you solve it by a flowchart. If you were solving algebraically, we would just start with the equation A equals pi r squared. And we just want to undo the operations in the correct order. So remember I said that you could follow BEDMAS backwards for the most part. So anything added, subtracted goes first. Well, I don't have anything added, subtracted, so then I'll do the multiplication next. So multiplied by pi, I will divide by pi to undo that operation. And then square, well, I'm going to do the opposite of a square is a square root, and I'm going to do the same on the other side. So whatever method you prefer is fine. If you want to do a flow chart, that's fine. If you want to solve algebraically, you can do that too. All right, so this one is volume of a sphere, and I want to isolate for R again. So if I did a flow chart, I start with R. First thing that happened to the R is it's cubed, right? Power 3. So I'll just write cube. So that's R cubed. Then we could say we're going to multiply by 4 pi. So that gives me 4 pi R cubed. And then we can say that we would divide by 3. So just make sure that you're doing everything in the correct order. And then we're going to undo that. So that equals V. So we're going to do the inverse operations to V. So multiply or divide by 3. We're going to multiply by 3. Times by 4 pi. We're going to divide by 4 pi. And then finally, cube, we're going to cube root. So make sure that you put the 3 in the roots to make sure that it's a cube root and not a square root. So r equals cube root of 3v divided by 4 pi. Okay, let's see if there's any questions here. There are none. Okay, the next question wants us to rearrange for r again. Pretty similar to the other one. Let's do this algebraically, just for something different. If you want to do a flow chart, that's fine. I'm going to divide by pi first. It doesn't matter whether I divide by the pi or the h first. Doesn't matter. Okay, they both have to be divided. So that gets rid of the pi. And so v over pi leaves me with r squared h. Then I'm going to get rid of the h, which is multiplied, so I'll divide this side by h. So that leaves me with v over pi h. And then last step, opposite of square is square root. So I'm going to square root the whole side, make sure everything goes inside the square root, and that leaves me with r. Okay. Okay, let's see. This one has a fraction in it. So it is, we're solving for v. So remember that one thing to keep in mind is that 1/2 multiplied by 1/2 is the same as divided by 2. Okay, that's sometimes helpful when we are undoing the operation to remind ourselves that multiplying by 1/2, I could also write it as divided by 2, so just put the 2 on the bottom. Okay, so I'm going to start with v, because I want to solve for v. First thing that's done to the v is square it. So v squared. Second thing I did, let's multiply by m. So we have mv squared. And then the last thing is divide by 2. So you could also put multiplied by 1/2. Same thing. So I think it's easier to just think about it as dividing by 2, but if you want to put multiplied by 1/2, that's fine. So we get that. And then that equals the letter E. So we're going to reverse. So divide by 2, we're going to multiply by 2. So 2E. So here, if you had multiplied by 1/2, you would be dividing by 1/2. And remember that dividing by 1/2 is the same as multiplying by the reciprocal. So you end up with 2e. We multiplied by m. We're going to divide by m. So 2e over m. And then we squared, so we're going to square root. So we get the square root of 2e divided by m. And that equals v. Okay. All right, so I'm going to mute myself for a minute. I'm going to get you guys to try this one. So you want to isolate for m. Let's see what you get. Okay, so let's have a look at this one. I'll do it. Let's do a flow chart. So we're solving for m. Okay, so the first thing that happened to the m is that you multiplied by that bracket. So you don't need to separate those terms in that bracket. We can just say the first thing we did was multiply by this whole bracket. And so we ended up with m multiplied by the bracket. And then after that, we divided by 50. I didn't divide by 50 first because the bracket is also divided by 50. So if you put divide by 50 first, then only the m would be divided by 50 and not the bracket. So we multiply by the bracket first, and then we divide both of them by 50. And that's over 50, and we end up with that. And so that equals s. So the first thing we'll do with the s is divide by 50, so we'll multiply by 50 and get 50s. And then we multiplied by the bracket, so we're going to divide by the bracket. Okay, so sometimes we can divide by a group of terms. And we end up with that. So 50 times s divided by the bracket 100 minus d. Okay, so that one was a little different. Okay, let's look at the next one. So this one, we want to solve for c. So the first thing we did to the c was multiply by 3. After that, we added n. And then the last thing is we divided by h. And I know I did the h last because the 3c and the n are both divided by h, so I know that that was done last. Okay, and then that equals the letter k. So we're going to reverse multiplied by h, gives me hk. Normally we write the letters in alphabetical order. KH is the same thing, so if you wrote k times h, that's fine. It's the same as h times k. Plus n becomes minus n. And then multiplied by 3, I will divide by 3. So it will be h, k minus n, all of it divided by 3. And that equals c. All right. So here is a word problem. It wants us to find, it gives us a formula for temperature in Celsius. And then it wants us to find the temperature in Fahrenheit. So what we're going to do is isolate the formula for Fahrenheit first. So sometimes it's easier to isolate. We could also put in the numbers and then solve for that variable. But I'm going to isolate for the F first, and then I'm going to put in the values. Okay, sorry, I didn't have my mic muted. Thank you, Mitchell, for pointing that out. Okay, so let's just, was there any issues on this question? I know that you probably couldn't hear me doing this. So I was just talking about, and it will come up on the recording, even though my mic was muted, it will still be recorded. So I was just saying here that when we multiply by, we can multiply by a bracket, right? We don't need to separate the 100 and the d. We can just say I multiplied m by the bracket and keep that whole thing together. Okay, so here we have a formula for Fahrenheit, and I want, or for Celsius, and I want to know the temperature of Fahrenheit. So I'm going to rearrange the formula for F. So I'm going to do that first. Okay, so starting with F, Fahrenheit. First thing is we subtracted 32. Right, we did that first because it's in the bracket. So F minus 32 was done first. I'm going to break the 5/9 into two operations. So instead of multiplying by 5/9, I'm going to say multiplied by 5, which gives me that, and then divided by 9. because 5/9 is really two operations, right? So it's multiplied by 5 and divided by 9. It's just easier when you take it apart. And then that equals Celsius. So multiplied or divided by 9 becomes multiplied by 9. So we get 9C. Multiplied by 5 becomes divided by 5. So we get 9C divided by 5. And then minus 32 becomes plus 32. So I can see that my formula for Fahrenheit is 9C over 5 plus 32. So now I can answer the question, what is the Fahrenheit when the temperature is minus 10? So now I can just put in minus 10 for C and then determine what the temperature would be in Fahrenheit. So oftentimes it's easier to rearrange the formula first and then plug in the numbers. So let's see what we get. So the temperature would be 14 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, would be minus 10 Celsius. All right. So this one is also in application. We have a formula for velocity. So velocity is determined by taking your initial velocity. So initial velocity is represented by the letter U. And then adding the acceleration, right? So A is acceleration times time, and time is t. Okay, so we want to rearrange the formula for acceleration. Maybe I'll do this one algebraically because it's not that difficult. It's only got two operations. So I want to isolate for A, so I'm going to inverse the U, which is positive, so we'll put minus U, and we'll do the same on the other side. So V minus U equals A times T, and then we want to isolate for A, so we'll divide by T, do the same on the other side. So V minus U over T equals A. And then once you have isolated for A, we can put in the numbers it wants us to find A if velocity is 32 and initial acceleration is, let's see, velocity is 32, 15, over time of 5 seconds. So let's see what the acceleration is. And acceleration is 3.4 meters per second. Okay, so some of these word problems will ask you to isolate or rearrange first, and then you are going to substitute in after.